fact is that to an extraordinary extent, by comparative standards, the United States is a business-run society, which means that human rights are subordinated to the overwhelming, overriding need of profit for investors. Decisions are placed in the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, which means that even if formal democratic practices exist as they do, they're of peripheral significance. The government, in fact, is, as John Dewey called it 50 or 60 years ago, the shadow cast by business over society, so that modifications in the shadow are not going to change the substance. These were truisms throughout most of American history, including American working class history, until quite recently, until the 1950s, in fact. And it also means that social policy is geared to the transfer of wealth and power to those who already have it, and deliberately so. Now, in more democratic societies, by that I mean societies where democratic forms function more, there are countervailing forces that enable the public to enter the arena of policy and decision. That's only true to a very limited extent, a remarkably limited extent in the United States, despite quite impressive democratic forms. The country was founded on the principle that James Madison explained in the Constitutional Convention, that the primary role of government is to protect property from the majority, and so it remains to a remarkable extent. Well, one of the most effective democratizing forces has always been the labor movement, labor unions. The history on that is completely clear. In countries that have a strong labor movement, there is also a very strong tendency, or a strong correlation with a real, live, functioning social contract that includes not only rights for working people, but for people who need help and protection, for the defenseless, for children, for women, for families, for people who need assistance generally, for the general public, in fact. And there's also a culture that goes along with it, a culture of solidarity and sympathy and mutual aid and support. In countries where unions are weak, like ours, we tend to find what's called tough love, as they call it these days, which means love for the privileged and tough for everybody else. We find what we might call, if we're honest, the really existing doctrine of free markets. That means market discipline for the poor and the defenseless, but plenty of protection and subsidy for those who really need it, the rich and the powerful. We find different psychological and cultural values, the ones that in fact were denounced by Adam Smith, whose motives were very much like those of the labor movement that developed later, and very much opposed to those of the people who distort his message and shamelessly use his name. We tend to find what he called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind: all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else, now reaching its sharpest expression in the Gingrich contract, to which the population is overwhelmingly opposed, incidentally, point by overwhelming margins if you look at public opinion polls. But in a country where democratic forms don't function, that's basically irrelevant. And they don't function in large part because we don't have a civil society with organized elements, unions being the central one, as they have been historically, that can be a countervailing force. And that's historically been the case. Here, as elsewhere, unions have been a leading force, probably the leading force, for democracy and human rights. That's true here as well. That's exactly why such enormous efforts have been undertaken in the United States in a really relentless and very self-conscious class war to undermine and destroy them. It's been going on for a long time. It peaked in the Reagan years. In the Reagan years, the United States simply rescinded Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, if you read it, guarantees elementary human rights of workers, including the right to form unions. And this is well known outside the United States, at least. So in 1991, the International Labor Organization in Geneva did something that it very rarely does. In fact, it's so rare I can't even think of another example. Namely, it condemned the leading industrial power, one of its paymasters, which it shrinks from doing almost always. The ILO condemned the United States in the case of Caterpillar Company, for hiring scabs, what they like to call permanent replacement workers. And the ILO called upon the United States to adhere to international labor standards. At that time, there were only two industrial countries that violated them. One was the United States, the other was South Africa. Well, South Africa has changed since then, so we now stand in splendid isolation on that one. In 1990, every year the ILO, the International Labor Organization, comes out with a World Labor Report. The 1995 edition came out a couple of months ago. It shows that the United States has the worst record in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe in adhering to and guaranteeing international conventions dealing with labor rights and workers' rights. Actually, I'm exaggerating a little. El Salvador and Lithuania are a shade worse, so we're actually third worse in Europe and the Western Hemisphere. The United States does not even recognize standard conventions on child labor or on the right to organize. Now, what's particularly interesting for students and faculty and people like us who live in the Athens of America is that all of this passes without any awareness and any comment. Try to find some commentary on these pretty amazing facts about the United States. What you can find is just praise for our magnificence as in, leading the way to every wonderful thing. Well, the methods for subverting, I don't want to suggest that everybody is lying about it. Not everybody's in the universities and the corporate media and so on. Sometimes the truth is told, and it's very often told in the business press, which tends to be more honest and open about these matters, much less concerned about that their audience might get out of hand, I suppose. The methods for subverting Article 23 during the Reagan years were reviewed in a cover story in Business Week that I'd really recommend to you. I've written about it, but I haven't seen any other reference to it. It's a cover story in Business Week just a year ago, last May. Very accurate, very honest, as the business press quite often tends to be. Business Week points out that, I'm just quote some things to give you the flavor. They say, over the past dozen years, meaning basically since the Reaganites took over the past dozen years, U.S. industry has conducted one of the most successful anti-union wars ever, with a chilling effect. The purpose, they're very clear about the purpose. They say management's basic goal was to undermine the rights that were guaranteed by the 1935 Wagner Act, which brought the United States into the civilized world, briefly. They were very quickly undermined. If there's time, I'll come back to that. Some of those rights are still guaranteed by law, but as Business Week points out, that's just a technicality. They don't make a comment on it, they just mention it. The basic method of this successful anti-union war was I'm still quoting, illegally firing thousands of workers for exercising their rights to organize. They point out that illegal firings increased by a factor of 6 for organizing from the late 60s to the late 80s, mostly during the 80s. Employers illegally fired, unlawful firings occurred in 1/3 of all representation elections in the late 80s. It's compared with 8% in the late 60s. And they quote a Harvard law professor who points out, even more significant than the numbers is the perception of risk among workers who think they'll be fired in an organizing campaign. And that's true. Any union organizer can tell you that. If the chances are that the employers will be able to simply fire people who exercise their legal rights with government protection, the risk of even entering into an organizing campaign, which is not small. There's plenty of sacrifices involved, as you know. That increases enormously. In this respect, this is very much like